afternoon. So without any further delay, I'll move on to our last speaker, Dr. Craig Stephen from the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative.
Thanks, Melissa. I want to start with two questions. Who else was here for the very first one of these meetings 14 or 15 years ago? You? Yeah, a few of you. Who else also used one of those early cell phones that Chelsea showed? If you do, you count as a senior member of the BC Zoonosis community, just so you know, and I would be one of those. It's really exciting for me to come back because this all started with, what, maybe 2 dozen of us, that first meeting, and it's fascinating and exciting to see everybody still here. Before I go on, I also have one editorial comment. Wildlife are not filthy, horrible things. And I say that somewhat facetiously because we're talking a lot about them being sources of viruses and other infections, but there's plenty of literature showing that the emerging disease movement has in fact increased society's fear of wildlife and decreased their interest in conservation. And we have to think of one of the primordial sources of human health and well-being as a healthy, robust, viable environment. So we always have to make sure we balance our messaging, be creating fear amongst the public about wildlife and about the need to conserve and preserve these important parts of our own community. So I want to start by giving you an overview of the Canadian program because, in my view, it's not meeting the needs of today. The wild bird approach in North America, in fact, I'd say in much of the world, was designed over a decade ago, and I think it's time to reflect, particularly on the heels of this latest outbreak, of whether it's still meeting the needs for today. But just a quick overview of what it does. So, we have to report it. Canada is obliged to report significant mortality or morbidity, including these high and low path avian influenzas, under the Animal Act, and as Vicki said, that's largely driven by trade concerns from the World Animal Health Organization. There's sort of 3 goals I think we have here. So when you look across the world as to why we are doing this, on the one hand, people want to find it fast to contain this pathogen to reduce trade impacts, or secondarily to have it spill into people. So this is very much a health belief model issue. In other words, they want to find information early to have farmers change their behavior in terms of biosecurity. Secondly, they want to find it so we prevent the movement of the virus between wildlife, poultry, and people. That's another goal that people bring up. To a large degree, though, it's about providing assurances. People want to know that this place is safe to trade, these animals are okay to eat, and that it's okay to go hunting. So those are the 3 broad general goals when you look at the literature of why people want to look at wild birds. In Canada, this is sort of the program in a nutshell. I'm going to see if I'm going to hit the, which one's the laser? The yellow one in the middle, that's got a pointy thing. So, we have reporting obligations. So to do that, they want to be vigilant for high path. And as I think Vicki mentioned, historically the dogma was focus on dead birds because they've died from high path and we're more likely to find them. But it's very rare, and that dogma's changing given the recent experience. High path AI, or low path AI, is quite common in live birds. In fact, we've had a few hundred low path AIs detected across Canada already this season, particularly in Ontario. Birds are fine, they swab them up to 30% in the fall migration can be positive. We do that to provide early warning to reinforce and encourage farmers to upgrade their biosecurity. Why does that do that? And we want to make sure that we're identifying biosecurity needs by learning more about the ecology of it. We also want to have this inform our science so we can anticipate future risks, and that includes looking at other birds like raptors and shorebirds. We have a big focus on waterfowl because they are accessible often, but there are other birds like shorebirds that have a greater diversity, and as we're seeing more with raptors, it can be surprising hosts for this. But in general, that's what we're trying to do in the Canadian setting. Now, we deliver on that goal differently across the country. This was based on 2014. The dark ones are people where the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative, which is a consortium of Canada's veterinary schools and the BC Animal Health Centre, they will deliver do the primary diagnostics and coordinate all the sample collection. In other places, like in BC, there's a consortium here between the Animal Health Centre, Forestry, Lands and Natural Resources, and Canadian Wildlife Service. 2014, there was nothing in Manitoba at all happening. Places like Newfoundland do their own thing but don't share it. So you see, we don't necessarily have the exact same program in every province. And so it's difficult to say we have a single coordinated one, but part of our role at the CWHC is to try to gather this information so we can get an idea of national trends that are going on. But because of that, the timeliness and the probability of detection is not going to be equivalent in every jurisdiction across the country. So let me just give you an example of how that affects this. So you can see when we get the data sent to us, certainly areas where there's high degrees of poultry farming, we get reports. But we've got large areas of this country where no reports are coming on, for which some I know there is testing being done, and other there isn't being testing done. So we have a challenge of information sharing. We also have significant differences in investment and effort in the system. You can see back here when the Americans gave us lots of money, lots of birds were seen. Whereas over the years when investment has gone down, our numbers have gone down of both the dead and live birds. Here's where we are so far from this year, and we've really increased our numbers by partly encouraging people to do some active surveillance and getting some provinces to invest. Just so you know, to date, out of our dead bird surveillance, they have found 5 H5s, 1 H7, out of the dead, 31 H5s, 7 H7s, all low path so far. But because our effort varies both geographically and in sample size, once again, we don't have a year-to-year to consistent effort, and that reflects variation in the funding that provinces and the federal government will give to the program. So that's a quick overview of the program, and what I want to spend a little bit of time now is asking, should what we do in the future after this new outbreak and this new situation affect our goals and methods? So to me, here is the surveillance program for any particular disease. You want to make some observations, but those observations are first determined by the priorities, the resources, and the knowledge we have to begin with. Although CFIA has said avian influenza is a high priority for them this year, there's been no new investment in wild bird surveillance. So that limits what we can see. You try to find some sort of signal that something has changed to create a warning. You evaluate that signal to ask, is it correct? Is it meaningful? To give you a forecast of the risk, ask if something can be done, communicate that in a way that will change people's behavior to have an outcome, and our outcome is to identify change environmental risk to poultry to inspire biosecurity actions. Ultimately, that's what we're using wild birds for. The question becomes, are we really talking about understanding risks when we focus almost exclusively only on finding the hazard? Pretty much all the effort in avian influenza surveillance deals with finding the hazard, but without an exposure and without vulnerability, there is no risk. If you look at the literature and you look at the way we've looked at avian influenza, there's almost nothing's been done on the exposure variables. Teresa Burns did some of her PhD work on that, but there's not a lot of literature out there when people talk about what is the frequency, the nature, and the types of exposures that would make that hazard into a risk. And virtually nothing done on tracking or understanding which makes an area, a barn, or a population vulnerable if there's indeed an exposure. So I think we can say right off the bat, we are not doing risk surveillance. We're doing hazard tracking detection. What's the likelihood of finding that hazard? Yes, Sean the sheep, that's right. Needle in the haystack. But there's issues of sample size. You saw on that slide the sample size varies from year to year based on investment. But when you come down to do that epidemiological calculation of sample size for wild birds, what do we do? Do we consider each subpopulation, each species differently? You saw from Vicky's, is a pintail duck as likely to be infected as a mallard or maybe a shorebird? So what's our denominator to begin with? There's many subpopulations, and the prevalence varies over the year. Young of the year birds coming down now tend to have a much higher prevalence than birds that return. How many do we need to examine? And what prevalence do we want to find? Do you want to find the first case or any cases? Do we look at live or dead, the most likely species, near a farm or distance? The CFA is very reluctant to have on-farm testing because if you find high-path avian influenza in a wild bird on a farm without signs in the poultry farm, officially, the legislation says you don't do anything. Unofficially, operations say, no, we'll quarantine that farm. So there's concerns about what you do with that. Do we go to crowded areas or anywhere, young or old? And then on top of it, what's our test reliability? When we're using dead birds, some have been frozen, when we have normal test area. Many of these questions haven't been adequately addressed when we ask, how do we try to find that hazard? So we're trying to think about how can we, in that flow of surveillance, either find earlier observations, make them more meaningful or more inspirational to inspire action. So what do you need for early warning? Here's the criteria for any early warning system. You've got to find the signal faster than by monitoring the population. And again, as Vicki pointed out, most high-path outbreaks in poultry were seen in domestic birds before wild birds. I think it's fair to say most. So, do we meet that criteria? Timely communication to inspire action. There can be up to a month delay from when that bird is found to when CFIA will communicate out the results. So we have communications problems. Capacity to verify the signal to avoid unnecessary response. I think we've got very good diagnosticians and very good laboratory methods to do that. A capacity to assess the risk associated with the warning signal. We're not monitoring exposure, we're not monitoring vulnerability, and there's adequate infrastructure and political will to undertake and sustain the system. And we've seen how that varies over the year. Despite those challenges, there has never been, in Canada or elsewhere, a systematic evaluation of wild bird programs as an early warning system. So in some ways, it's faith-based science that we think this is making that difference right now. So Chelsea started to talk a little bit about expanding the notion of where the hazard is, or what the hazard is. So both she and a group that we're working with, Wilfrid Laurier, are trying to look at things like landscape and bird ecology. Can we find changes in landscape? What is the significance of having 5 years of massive drought in California, a big drought this year in BC, for aggregation and movements of wild ducks on the land? Does that make a difference? What about if it flooded next year? So are there other signals that we can see? And you can't see this right now. We're developing a system where we can actually start to look at historical trends on a town-by-town basis to include some information. There are still the questions of would there be ducks in or near my farm? You saw Michelle sampling the virus. And then we've got, is this virus strain banned? So the CFA and the lab's doing here. We've got Chelsea out there. The standard stuff's here. We're not reporting it timely enough or locally enough, and we're not looking at the conducive strain. So the question becomes, when we're doing hazard detection, how far back in the chain do we have to work in order to inspire those early actions? When we talk to the poultry industry, take out the health belief model and say, has anybody asked the farmers what they need to know to change their behavior? Nobody's asked them that question. Will this, that it's H5 subtype, clay type, I don't remember all the numbers. Does the farmer want to know that? Or does the farmer want to know the pond scum's got virus in it? Does the farmer want to know there's going to be a lot of ducks coming my way? Nobody's asked that question, so we don't know how these hazards are affecting their changes in their behaviors. So, health belief model, right? These are the things you got to know to change in action. They've got to perceive the threat. They've got to know the outcomes are going to work. Are they susceptible? Is it serious? Are there benefits to acting? Are there barriers to acting? And fundamentally, if the industry doesn't believe these ones right now, that's outreach. And I think in the Fraser Valley, the farmers believe it's serious. They believe there's some benefit to action. You heard Vicki's tale of that. So really what we can affect by inspire action is perceived susceptibility to the problem. That's the place we can potentially act to help modify their activities. So can we start thinking, instead of hazard detection, about thinking about things like vulnerability assessment, where we ask, is it possible that you're vulnerable? Is a hazard there? Is it a type that could be bad? And is there enough exposure? If there's enough exposure, is your farm ready to deal with it? Is your biosecurity in place? Are there systems in place to do that? Are you a highly vulnerable facility? Some of these things we can look at in advance of the outbreak, particularly if the hazard is not just the virus. So start to ask farmers, going towards Chelsea's red, green, yellow light, what do you know about your farm, your situation, your landscape that suggests you better act now? Because what the industry is telling me is you cannot keep biosecurity to AI levels all the time. There's been interesting studies that were done in foot and mouth disease after the big outbreak in the UK. Within weeks of the outbreak, biosecurity goes down. There was a great study done in a Quebec swine farm, I think. So the poultry or swine, where they said to the staff, we're going to film you. We've got a video camera right here. We're going to train you on biosecurity, and we're going to film you. Within 6 weeks, they were back down to low levels. So maintaining that biosecurity, the industry is looking for ways to continually motivate people to change, and understanding to prime them to these changes need more than saying, You know, a month ago there was a dead duck with a high-path virus in there. So how do we start thinking about doing things like vulnerability audits? Because we know disease isn't uniformly distributed. So can we start, instead of just looking at the virus, say, we want to look at populations, both viral populations and susceptible populations, waterfowl or poultry. We want to look at different places. Are there places on the farm to exclude the hazards? What's the barn's interface with nature? We want to look at behaviors like the animal behaviors like Chelsea was talking about and the human worker behaviors, so we can start thinking about vulnerability surveillance as opposed to simply tracking a hazard. So what we're trying to argue for at the CWHC is shifting from a hazard surveillance model to a disease intelligence model. We have these embedded signals that start off by knowing the socio-ecological environment, what's happening with the landscape, and what's the capacity for the farm and the industry to do something. While the Fraser Valley might be very well primed for understanding what to do, jurisdictions that haven't experienced an outbreak may not be as primed for that, or maybe the backyard farm might not be. We need to know more about the exposures. What about the wild bird proximity? Are they there? Are they coming? When will they be there? And are there barriers on that farm, either landscape or operational barriers that can prevent viral traffic? And finally, what are the local signals of the virus being shed in the environment or being present on the farm? Certainly, this is less inspiring because it's less predictive, but it's earlier. So we're trying to think about and trying to talk to the industry. Are they interested in start thinking about a health intelligence model for avian influenza that can help be tailored to local areas rather than focusing on disease? So if you think about what we have in Canada right now for a program, I mean, here's the continuum of a complete program. You want people to be aware, you want them to be alert, we want to communicate it, and we want to act. So they need to be aware of the hazards, vulnerability, coping capacity. They want to be alert about changing where the virus is, changing on the exposures, changing susceptibilities, communicate to the right time, the right scale to the right people, to reduce the impact, prevent it, eliminate, or create resilience. The X's are suggest things that we're not touching on at all. We're not talking about vulnerability or coping. We're not talking about exposures. We're not talking about susceptibilities. You can't see that very well. There's a question mark. Are we talking to the right people at the right time at the right scale? And prevention, again, as Vicki suggested, this is an endemic pathogen that's going to come back. The ducks will have it. People will move it. I'm worried about the industry giving it back to waterfowl. We're not going to eliminate it. Nobody talks to a great degree about producing the resilience of either the waterfowl or the populations to cope with this. So there's lots of areas that we need to think about improving if we want to actually have a full-scale avian influenza readiness program with wild birds. Now, there's implications for making some of these suggestions. One, of course, is money. You know, how big does this have to be? Do you have to test every farm, all dead birds, all the time? We can't afford that. You saw the numbers there. We were at a few thousand birds, and that was stretching. That was at calling in favors to get that done this year. How do we validate the vulnerability system? Because avian influenza is normal, do you have to have an on-farm vulnerability assessment every year? Do you have to have an on-farm exposure assessment every year? Who is going to do that? Can that be rolled into industrial auditing? Is it going to be such a burden that they don't see the value in that when there's other more pressing issues? And again, Chelsea, as she noticed, she's got her bulky cell phone, but now we have to validate that, we have to ground truth it and show it's worthwhile. And there are big implications that said earlier about trade. What are the CFA is very worried that a trading partner is going to say, you found high-path avian influenza on a poultry farm, we're going to shut down trade until you can show it's not in those farms. So there's a lot of political fear about changing some of these things. So this right now really limits current testing away from farms. Now, despite my profound pessimism, the Canadian model is actually on par or better than a lot of other ones around the world. So we are meeting international expectations. And by looking at avian influenza the way we have in wild birds in the past has greatly increased our understanding of AI ecology. We've shown that waterfowl, not just ducks and geese, but other water birds, can be important sources and mechanisms of spread. We've learned a lot about pathogenesis and virus shedding, courses of infection. A lot's been learned by using the methodologies that we have now in place. It has tremendously informed biosecurity. It probably reduced the trade impacts of the disease here because when people were finding it in wild birds, that wasn't sufficient in the US to shut down trade markets. And it really has supported lab networking both within the human labs and between human and public health labs. We are meeting our international obligations with this model. one of the ways we can do that are the performance expectations for an avian influenza system are sufficiently imprecise that allows a lot of wiggle room for what you need to do. Will it truly meet the goals of early warning? Well, it really depends on what you mean by early, and it really depends on what you mean by who you're trying to warn and what you're trying to do. We are trying to encourage CFIA to do a systematic review of the avian influenza program and ask if it's in fact achieved some of the goals they set out to do. And I think there needs to be time to say, despite learning a lot in the last 10 years, we need to rethink about what we need to do going forward. Vicki brought that up in her talk from a management goal perspective, but we also have to think about it from a surveillance and design perspective. And I think that's true not just for avian influenza, but for a lot of our zoonotic diseases. I've got to tell you, I'm a genius in retrospect. I have solved so many outbreaks afterwards by saying, you know, we shouldn't have done that, right? I think probably most of them have done that. We don't want to get good at writing papers and finding what we did wrong. We want to get better at anticipation by moving towards this health intelligence model. And I think that avian influenza is an excellent example of our need for national networking so we can start to learn better about what's going on. This idea of these that flyways are these stovepipes through which birds can't get off is such a fallacy that we need to actually realize it's a much more complex dynamic ecosystem for which we have to share with each other. So the CWHC is trying to encourage that we modernize our approach to avian influenza whilst at the same time maintaining a system that meets international expectations and obligations and have teams and networks in place so that when something happens, they can follow up and respond to those. So with that, I'll take any questions if there's time, Melissa. I know. I don't know yet.
Thanks very much. Do we have any quick questions for Craig before lunchtime? Well, we had a question about what is done for wild bird surveillance on the webinar. I think that Craig answered that. The webinar person, please write if you would like to ask any more specific questions. Anybody else, or is everyone remembering Brian's feed trough and ready to get out there? Well, good. I think it's been a great morning. Thanks to all of our speakers, and please do find them if you have questions.